Professor Beverly Skeggs from the Department of Sociology, and I'm delighted to be hosting tonight's event. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you. We are really pleased to hold this public lecture tonight, which is the third lecture in the series. And I'm sure you're familiar with our public lectures by now. And I'd like to seize this opportunity to say thank you so much for the support over the years, particularly during last year where we moved our seminar series online. We had hoped to have Danny live at least 2 years ago, but at least we've got him now virtually. So Professor Danny Dorling is the Halford Mackinder Professor in Geography at the University of Oxford. Danny is one of the most exciting academics around. He has so many different interests built into one body. It's quite extraordinary that he manages to do so much, but he's always really interesting. His work on inequality is groundbreaking. It's global and it's national. His data visualizations are incredible, and I really recommend that you look at his website. They improve constantly and really make research come alive. He's also incredibly good at statistics. So a social theorist, a data visualization person, a statistician, all in one body. Really good. And he did some of the most important statistical analysis of Brexit that I thoroughly recommend you check out. More recently, he's turned his hand, or his many heads, to health and happiness, and a new book on Finnish well-being has come out, Finnish happiness. And he wrote one of the most important articles over the last couple of years. In fact, I think it was 3 years ago. It was on life expectancy and the decline in life expectancy in Britain, a very significant article that informs tonight's lecture. So in tonight's lecture, he's going to explore progress among human beings. Is it actually slowing down from the technological advances? Are they advances to birth rates, and what this means for the future? So I will now hand over to Danny. I hope you'll have a thoroughly enjoyable evening, and I'd like to give the virtual floor to him. Thank you very much, Danny. Looking forward.
Thank you, Bev, and thanks ever so much for inviting me to speak tonight. It's great to be able to do this, and it's actually wonderful to see people in the chat from Mexico, Canada, the USA, Buenos Aires, and Cumbria, slightly nearer to where you are. Let me put up some slides for you. The title of this talk, which is "To What Extent is the Human Species Slowing Down?" The short answer I'm going to give you is a lot. We're slowing down a lot in many, many ways. And this answer, I think, matters because I came to this conclusion in a book I wrote called Slow Down, The End of the Great Acceleration and Why It's a Good Thing, which was published in January 2020, just as reports were coming out of China to suggest that there was something happening which might affect the world, but we had no idea what it was. What I'm going to show you are a series of images and graphs to try to convince you that before the pandemic came, we were already slowing down in all kinds of ways, and we weren't necessarily aware of it. And I'll explain the picture of the sandcastle at the very end. We tend to think, and we tend to be told, that we're accelerating, that things are going faster than ever before. Politicians like to quote that it feels like it's going faster than ever before, but in future, today will appear slow because we'll have so much progress and so much speed to come. Now, that kind of thing was true at the time of their grandparents, but it may not be true now, although it depends on how you look at it. The graphs here are standard graphs of human population growth over thousands of years. And if you plot graphs like this, then it looks as if we're in the middle of an incredible acceleration at the moment. But that is because of the scale that's being used here. I'm going to show you this same graph, same data, but drawn a very different way in a few slides' time. And you get the opposite impression to thinking that it's just going up and up and up. Currently just below 8 billion people in the world. But this talk of speeding up is common, it's normal. Many of you from abroad went, well, maybe you do know this man. He was a journalist in 2007. His name was Boris Johnson. And back then he wrote that the world's population is now 6.7 billion, roughly double what it was when I was born. If I live to be in my mid-80s, then it will have trebled in my lifetime. I simply cannot understand why no one discusses this impending calamity and why no world statesman has the guts to treat this issue with the seriousness it deserves. We seem to have given up on population control, said Boris, before he personally gave up on population control himself. The graphs. These graphs are a little bit unusual, so I'm going to explain them with a couple of toy examples. And the reason they're unusual is that they're designed to concentrate about change. And so on the vertical axis of the graph, you have the thing that we're measuring, in this case, population, for a fictional country which had 100 million people in it in the year 1950, and has population growth of 2% a year, so that by the year 2020, it had reached a population of 400 million. That is, if you like, slow exponential growth. The horizontal axis of these graphs is showing how many people are being added each year. And as it moves across to the right, the number of people being added grows and grows. Even though it's 2%, the same relative amount, of course, 2% of an ever-growing number is a bigger number. And you get a straight line in this. The dots become further and further apart as the thing speeds up, and you can see exactly how it is moving. It's called a phase portrait. I'll show you the most famous one at the very end of these phase portraits. They're used in physics, not much used in social science. So there's a basic picture of a slow speeding up. I'm less worried about explaining weird graphs nowadays because we've gone through a couple of years of looking at lots of graphs, and I think most people understand what exponential growth now is and isn't. The quote on the side, if you've been reading fast, is from Charles Darwin in The Origin of Species. And Charles Darwin talked about how occasionally in the life of a species, I think he was talking about elephants, there can be 2 or 3 favourable seasons. And in those favourable seasons, the population of that species explodes. Now, the irony is that at the very time that Charles Darwin was writing that, human beings themselves were going through a population explosion, as I'll show you. But population explosions come to an end, and ours is coming to an end. The favourable seasons, the seasons of very, very rapid growth, are over. So there's a phase portrait showing a steady increase. Next, I'm going to show you a slightly more complicated one. Again, hypothetical, again, just made up, again, starting with a country with 100 million people in 1950, and again with the population originally rising by 2%, but then only by 1.9% after 1951, then by 1.8, 1.7, 1.6, so that by 1970, the population is increasing by 0%. It's not going up or down at all. You see that little red dot just passing 1970 now at the height. And then the population begins to fall faster and faster and faster in terms of a percentage. But after a certain time, it's fallen so low that even though that percentage is growing, the number of people declining is less and less because there's hardly anybody left. And then by the year 2070, you have the last human being in this hypothetical country with a declining population. And you see it produces a pretty pattern, a picture, a shape, something that you can compare with other changes. So if you're interested in the rate of change, these graphs really, really show that in detail. Those are the last 2 graphs which are made up data. Everything from now on I'm going to show you is real data. And I'll start off not with population, something which might interest those people viewing from the USA. This is a graph of the total US student debt as recorded every quarter from 2006 to around 2018. And you'll see it's got a distinct shape. The first thing you might notice is that it wiggles. Normally every October, when the new students go to university in the US, it hits a particular high, it then reduces, and the rest of the year goes up again. So it zigzags across. But more importantly, you can see that until 2009, it was veering ever so sharply to the right. Now that was speeding up. US student debt was not just growing, it was growing by more and more each year. Now, of course, when anything does that, it can't carry on doing that forever. There was a financial crisis in 2008 that is very probably directly linked to why the graph changes its slope at that point. And there'll come a time when US student debt no longer grows. It may seem impossible to imagine that, but all these things eventually do happen. We don't know how they're going to happen, but what we can do is we can look at history and say, when did the breaking slope occur? Is it still speeding up faster than ever? Or has there begun to be a slowdown in the rate of increase? And that's what you see here for the billions of US student debt. Let's have a look at a different example. This example is about technology. And there are very, very many ways in which you can try to measure changes in technology. You can look at various estimates for how many giga and zigabytes of data storage there are in the world, or how fast are chips improving in computers, and is Moore's law still operating, and so on. What I've done here is taken a simple example of high quality data. This is the number of entries in Wikipedia from the point of when Wikipedia began in 2001, right through to 2019 again. And you'll see that 2007 was the year of the peak growth of Wikipedia, when more pages were being added than ever before. And then it began to slow down, still growing in size, not shrinking, but there was a limit to how many things you could put in Wikipedia, how many things people would actually want to write about, let alone want to read about. Around about 2005, they added stubs, which is kind of subheadings, and that created little increase again, but that slowed down. It's a way of looking at the speed of change of these things. And the question is everything like this? Does it speed up and then slow down? Or are there some things which are still speeding up? Here's an example of something which is still speeding up. There are four things I found. I looked at several hundred data sets. The data has to be high quality, otherwise your rate of change estimates are just rubbish and you get very, very messy graphs. But this is carbon dioxide emissions worldwide as estimated. And you can see that they were not always rising. Most years they were rising, but in the oil crisis of 1974, you can see the little line crosses the axis, and they didn't rise for a bit because we couldn't afford to buy the oil as much to burn it as much. In the global recession in the early 1980s, emissions fell. In the recession in the early 90s, they fell. In the 2008 crash, they didn't quite fall. And in 2018, they were accelerating. And in general, emissions, at least since the year 2000, have been going up faster and faster than before. I've also put on this graph the Rio Earth Summit, the Kyoto Protocol date, the Paris climate change, and of course, if it was updated most recently, you put the Glasgow COP26 date. And you can maybe look at these and say, actually, it's a bit sad. In the years after or immediately following one of these great summits where we declare that we need to save the planet, it's as if we've kind of thought that we've done something and then we don't do something very much at all. But that's one of the things that is still speeding up and will still be speeding up probably despite the pandemic. Although it may be a year or so before we're actually sure of that. Go forward again to a different variable. And when you make a claim about everything slowing down, you do have to look at a lot of things. Sorry, before we get to the next variable, in case those graphs are hurting your head, this is the reason why we draw them. This is emissions again, exactly the same data as the last graph, but now drawn on a conventional measure. And you can see the rise, but what you won't notice unless you're very, very observant are the times when emissions actually fell. It just looks like a steady slope going up. You don't see the nuance, you don't see the hints that other things are possible. A conventional graph is very good for conveying a simple message to a large audience very quickly. It is not good at looking at questions of rate of change if that's what you're interested in. If you're interested in deceleration, acceleration, slowdown, speeding up, then the conventional graph hides all of that in the movement of that dot rather than sharing it out. Here's my second variable that's speeding up, and it's related to emissions, but it's more complicated. This is the NASA series of temperature estimates from 1880 to, again, just before the pandemic. And I think it shows why we weren't sure about global warming in the past, because, you know, before the 1950s, there were many years in which temperatures were actually falling. They may have been rising, but, you know, it was hard to be sure that they were rising that much. And even in the 1960s and 70s, it was not necessarily that obvious. And there were years again associated with global recessions in the 80s and the 90s and the financial crash of 2008, when the world temperature rose much less than in other years. It's really only since 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13 then, when the graph veers off to the right, that it becomes really, really obvious that we are absolutely warming up. And even then, there's a slight fall to 2017. So if you're interested in the subtlety of change, you can see it with these kind of images in a way that that basic graph, the normal graph of temperature, would show it rising with little wibbles. And those little wibbles, those little wriggles are spirals on this kind of a graph. We think it's still going to rise. We think it's still going to rise and possibly rise by more on average in future years than it has in the past, right? It's another form of acceleration. What we talk about happening in general, but what is actually very rare. I've only shown you two accelerations so far, emissions and global surface temperature of the planet. I'm going to move forward again if you're following that little red dot. The reason for the little red dot, by the way, is that when I'm doing these lectures in public in an actual building, the brilliant thing about the red dot is that it stops the audience looking at me and they all follow the dot, a bit like how a cat will follow a light if you shine it on a wall. You can't help but follow the little red dot. Here's a real big slowdown and deceleration. This is the human population of the world. Last 2,000 years, their estimates. It's the United Nations figures and the United Nations projections. From 2017, the 2019 projections actually fell even more than what next ones to come out we expect to be lower. But let me just describe it to you from the beginning. And on the vertical axis, you've got billions of people. On the horizontal axis, you've got how many millions are being added every year. We can't see much about the early centuries, but you then see this incredible speed up from 1940, 1950, 1960s, not just more people every year, but more people than the year before, until you get to the 1980s. And then that speed up stops. We're still adding 80 million people a year, but then after 2020, we begin to add fewer and fewer and fewer. And although we can't be sure about what's happening, we can be pretty sure about it because most of that growth in recent years has been people living longer. If you double human life expectancy, if you manage to massively reduce infant mortality to double human life expectancy, you get twice as many people on the planet at any one time without any additional people having to be born. And that was part of the reason for that acceleration. But look, the acceleration was in the time of our grandparents. It was in the time of my childhood, and I'm almost as old as Boris. It stops for most of the last few decades, and then it slows and slows and slows and slows until a point, and that point's come more closer recently, when very young children alive today are estimated to be the first human beings in the history of our species who will see population numbers stabilize and probably fall across the planet. And that's quite a momentous slowdown. It's one of the most important slowdowns of all. I'm now going to show you this same graph, but drawn a different way so that you can look at and actually see some of the early data, because it's hidden here. Once it's below 1 billion people, you can hardly see what's going on. And all I'm going to do is alter the scale to be log scales on the vertical axis and log scale on the horizontal axis. Still going up from 0 to 1 billion, but then to 10 billion. And on the horizontal axis, you're now looking at increases of 100,000 people, 1 million people, 10 million people. The shape of the curve is very nice and very simple in a way. I mean, if we could add more detailed data and it would wiggle around a bit, the Black Death would fit in and so on. But the key changes are not hard to see. The first key change, we were speeding up slowly and then a bit more quickly. The first key change happens just before the year 1500. It's actually 1492. And it's when people from the old world went over to the new world, taking their diseases with them, which could have included a common cold, by the way, and decimated the population of the new world. Not so much that the overall total global population probably fell. Population was still rising in the old world, maybe fast enough to counter that. But the tens of millions of people who died in the Americas when Christopher Columbus first turned up and those germs transmitted across have kinked the graph. The second kink in the graph, the one that occurs after 1820, is most closely associated with colonialism. It's associated with the British. We walked into more than 170 now members of the United Nations, they weren't then, uninvited, invaded these countries and often upset social systems which have been stable for centuries, if not millennia, in the case of Australia. When you upset stable social systems, you get population booms. When you take millions of people in slavery, you get population booms. So you see something from 1820 to 1850, which is as big in terms of a slowdown of human population as occurred with the discovery of the New World as far as the Old World was concerned. And then after 1850, you see the acceleration again, and you can see that particular fast acceleration after 1920, 1940, because infant mortality came down, and then you see the curve going round. But what you're about to see, maybe the year 2100, maybe earlier, maybe later, is that that dot is expected to carry on moving right across to the axis, and we actually get global population falling. Let's move away from the world and just look at some particular places in the world. Here's China. And with all these places, and I've included as many as I can in the book, there are fascinating differences to do with historical events. In the case of China, it's the Opium Wars, which we don't teach much about in Britain, but they do in China. And you know, the interference from foreign powers in China actually causes that little loop from the 1840s, the 1850s, 1860s, population falls and rises again. You then see great acceleration to 1951. The average family had 6 children. Reduces a bit, speeds up again. You have a one-child policy. That reduces population. We then begin to abandon the one-child policy in this century. Encouragement to have more children doesn't have much effect. And after 2030, given the number of people who've been born, given how old the population is, the population is expected to begin to fall, then to fall faster as that dot moves further away from the axis, and getting down to 1 billion people just 79 years from now, by the year 2100. Now you may say, oh, well, that's China. We know about China. It's unusual, but it's not just China. Let's look forward. Let's look, I think, at the whole of Africa. And these are all the countries of Africa combined, the UN projections as they were in 2017. And even here, the slowdown comes later. 2050, 2060 is when you no longer see more people added than the year before. And 2080, 2090 is when you begin to see fewer people being added than the year before. The population of Africa goes up to 4 billion, but it is slowing down. I happen to think it'll slow down faster than this. And one of the reasons for that is that we can look at particular kinks in graphs like this, and we actually see that there was an acceleration in the 1970s, 1980s with structural adjustment, when the IMF wouldn't allow African countries to, for instance, pay for girls to go to school at the age of 13, 14, 15 and 16 because they have to pay back debts. And if you do that, population rises. So that's Africa. Let's go forward to another population, almost, well, actually it's bigger, India. And again, you see that same acceleration in the 60s and the 70s. Again, a lot of it had to do with improving health, babies not dying, and then the babies grow up and have children themselves. But the kink turned 21 years ago, 22 years ago, the year 2000. And ever since then, the number of people being added to the population of, this is India, Bangladesh and Pakistan, has been less than the year before. And as that curve bends down, the deceleration is expected to speed up. So the Indian subcontinent hits a peak in the year 2064, not very far away, and then begins to fall. Now, if you remember the graph I showed you at the very beginning, the conventional graph of the runaway train, the population just zooming up completely out of control. This, on the same data, gives you a completely different impression. And there's a lag between when we first begin to understand this is happening and when we actually teach children it's happening. So often university students will tell me, world population numbers are out of control. And you have to say, are they really? What are the numbers that are expected in the future? And how does that rate of change compare to the past? I'll move forward again. Away from population, something else you may think is accelerating, and it can look on this graph as if it is, and it certainly was. This is GDP. GDP per capita for the whole world, an odd statistic. In fact, it was a statistic that we didn't really create until the 1940s and 50s, but people have estimated it back in time. And you can see it was high, this is in absolute terms, and rising 50s, 60s, 70s, but it then fell again in the 80s global recession, fell in the 90s global recession. You see a pattern happening here, how everything is connected, emissions, pollutions, temperature. Falls in the great financial crash of 2008, accelerates up again 2010, falls a little in 2015, accelerates, and we know what's going to happen next. It'll go right across that axis when we get the final global estimates for 2020, 2021, and then speed up a little bit. But what was happening before the pandemic? Now, I'm going to show you the same graph again, but again, just as I did for population, I'm going to change the vertical scale to be a log scale. So same thing, here we go. Now, the reason for looking at GDP at a log scale is that you're really interested in relative change. Your salary rising from $1,000 to $2,000 is equivalent, given all other changes, to it rising later on from $10,000 to $20,000. It's the relative change that matters. And when you lose a log scale, so you're looking at relative changes, you actually see that the peak of GDP growth was the 1950s. It was slightly slower in the 1960s and 1950s. It was slower again in the 1970s, that oil crash of 1973, 74. It was slower again in the 1980s. It appeared to pick up for a short amount of time with a little peak in 2006 before crashing to 2008 and then wobbling all over the place. But if you squint, and this is the least scientific part of all of this, if you squint and look at that graph, I think you can see that from 1950, or at least from 1964, it is leaning to the left. Rising, but rising slower each year, on average, than the year before. So a deceleration of the growth of GDP per capita worldwide. So that's not something which is speeding up. So far, we've only had carbon emissions and temperatures speeding up. Going to go through to another graph in the middle in a second. Just looking at part of the world in GDP, part of the world which is often thought to be speeding up more than others. And that part is China. And it was certainly true that in the 1980s and after a brief slowdown in the early 1990s, in the 2000s, GDP growth in China was not just fast, it was getting faster and faster and faster. 2010 was a peak of growth. It slowed down a bit then. The West had less money after the financial crisis to buy goods, but speeded up again to 2017, slowed down again. In 2019, you've almost certainly forgotten. There was talk of a worldwide recession on the horizon because of the slowdowns that were being measured at that time. We forget about that. We can easily think that we were living in a different time, in a time of speed up and so on before, but it wasn't. It was slowing down. And of course, when we come to update this graph, GDP growth now in China is much, much less than it was before. Because there are fewer people with the money to buy the goods, there was less need to buy some of the goods, and quite a lot of the goods are actually stuck in ports and containers in various parts of the world at the moment. When you have an economic slowdown, when less is produced, less is bought, less is consumed. Let's go on to a different topic. You might be wondering whether these graphs can predict the future in some way. And I'm going to try and demonstrate why not. This is the NASDAQ. And if you'd really know what you're doing in the 1970s and 80s and you wanted to get rich, what you'd have done is invested in stock in the NASDAQ. It's the high-tech stock, the kind of Facebooks and Apples and Microsoft and Netflix of its day. They came later. And you'll see that there was an incredible takeoff after 1993 in the value of the NASDAQ. It just zooms off. So what happened after then? That's exponential growth at an incredible rate, 93, 94, 95, 1996. And these curves look quite smooth. So can we see what happens next? There we go. That's zoomed out to 96 to 99. And bang, you can see it's gone negative. That's a dot-com crash. Goes round like a roller coaster, does a little loop inside the first loop, 2007, 2008 with the financial crash, 2010, rises again, slows down 2015, rises again, looks as if it's about to do another great big loop and crash round again in 2019. But what actually happened when the pandemic hit, February, March, April, is the value of shares in Apple, in Netflix, in Facebook, in all these things, of course, rose dramatically. So that little red dot from 2019 will skedaddle right off back to the right again and zoom around again. You can't use these graphs to predict the future. You can just use them to look at the past and see it differently to how you saw it before, forcing you to concentrate on rates of change, acceleration, deceleration, slow down, or getting faster. A few more examples and just 10 more minutes, I think, of me talking. So please think of some questions. It's impossible to measure everything, but luckily not that many things are measured so accurately that you can use this technique. This is human height, average human height, brilliant data set. And I should say there's a free website. If you just Google Danny Dorling slow down, you'll find it, all the data, all the sources, animations of these are up there. So you can know where I got the data from, which makes you not feel guilty about not acknowledging it now. Human height increases dramatically when you get better nutrition and better health, as so much of the world got in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. At the same time as that infant mortality was falling, life expectancy was rising. But once you've achieved that change, once you've got the nutrition better, the gains become less. And actually and this is height, this is by the year of birth of people. That's why it's way back in 1996, because we're measuring their height 18 years later as adults. Most recently, average height of human beings in the world has fallen. That isn't because any group has got shorter, it's because the mix of who's in the world has changed. So there are people from countries where people still tend to be shorter than from countries where they tend to be taller. Within every country, you've still got height rising, but rising really slowly. And if you find it hard to imagine this worldwide, just think about your own grandparents and their average height, your parents and their average height, your height, have children and they're grown up, their height. And I like going to university graduations because you can see this, because the parents are at the graduation as well as the children. And we know they're genetically connected, and the parents are several inches shorter on average than the children. But what this graph is showing is that is slowing down. We're not going to become giants in the future. Something has changed. It was changing very fast in the past. People were getting taller and taller, from admittedly some of the shortest that they've been in the industrial revolutions around the world. And we've improved our height in a way back to the kind of heights the hunter-gatherers had, and now it isn't going to change very much again. Go forward again. Here's the third thing that's actually speeding up. And if you remember, you're told that everything is speeding up, but actually, it's very hard to find things that are speeding up. This is a UNESCO estimate of the proportion of people in the world, young adults in the world, who've gone to university at some point. And it gets up to around about a third by the year 2014. And you can see that it's leaning to the right, so it's not just going up, it's accelerating more and more. But the reason we know that this can carry on accelerating is, well, you can't go past 100% of young people going to university. So at some point, this will begin to curve round and it will stop rising. That may well be near to 90%. Just as we used to only have a small proportion of people go to schools, and then that increased for universal primary education, and we only had a small proportion of people carry on at school at say age 15, 16, 17. And then that became universal in many, many countries and almost most countries in the world. So too, tertiary education university will continue to rise, but the speed of that rise cannot continue to accelerate upwards. That's going to have to slow down. But it's the third thing I found that's speeding up. I'm not showing you many, many of the things that are slowing down because in hindsight, they're quite obvious. Let's go back down to slow down again. Here's something that's really slowing down. This is the Zoological Society of London's estimate of the proportion of large species that had become extinct by each year. By the year 2013, I think that's when their data stopped, when they were fairly sure, 70% of large species on the world had become extinct. Most of these that have become extinct were species that were quite rare to begin with, ones that were living on small islands and we disturbed their islands and so on. But it's an enormous number. And you may be looking at that and thinking, why is it slowing down? And the answer, if you like, is rather obvious. The rates were high in the 1970s. If we let little red dot go to the beginning, you can see we had 1 or 2% increases in species extinction every year, particularly high in the 1980s. But after you'd made extinct the most rare species, there were less to make extinct. Again, we actually get a drop in 89, increases again in the 1990s, but slows down and isn't increasing that much now. Why not? Well, if it hadn't done that, we wouldn't be here to talk about it because we're one of these species. We're only left with 30% of them. It's a tragic story, but it isn't a story of accelerating biodiversity loss. The fastest rates of biodiversity loss and species extinction have already occurred and are irreversible. So something slowing down, but not necessarily a good news story. Forward again, and to our final example of something accelerating. And this is the number of air passengers in the world. It isn't the number of people flying, because this includes many people who fly many times a year, but it's the number of air passengers, which by the year 2017 had got up to 4 billion, 4,000 million passengers a year. And again, if we start way back in 1970, you can see it wiggles around, and you can see it falls in 1980 with a recession. See, it falls again in the early 90s recession. You see, it actually fell at the time of the dot-com crash in 2001, rises again, it's leaning to the right, always rising in general, falls again in the 2008 financial crash, speeds up 2009, 2010. 1 year was a bit of slowdown, I think jet fuel cost more, and then faster and faster and faster, it moves off to the right and it rises and it rises, and it looks like we're going to see more and more and more airplanes in the sky. And then bang, 2020 just stopped. Okay, I haven't got the latest data, there's always a lag in data, and we're partly waiting to see at what level it rises again, but I'm hopeful it'll never, maybe I'm wishful thinking, an optimist, but I'm hopeful it never gets back up to its 2017 level. Many of those flights were for business meetings that we know are entirely unnecessary because we're doing this, we can talk like this. You know, so unless it's a slightly dodgy free holiday, why were you actually flying across the Atlantic that much? It's going to be hard to justify that in future. You know, forget about the carbon and the pollution and the cost and every other reason you might not want to do it. We know that you can talk to somebody perfectly well without having to travel there. The second part of the big rise is maybe harder to see a decline in, and that is in rich countries and unequal countries. As much as a quarter of all flights are taken just by the top 1% of people by income, the richest people. And while we still have high income inequality, we may not see this fall as fast as we could otherwise. We can't guess about the future, but we can look at the past. And as I say, this was the fourth thing out of hundreds that I actually found speeding up. Everything else, technology, inventions, consumption of various items, paper, toys, it was not going up as fast as it had been going up before. Almost at the end. Just 2 or 3 more of these graphs to show you. Here's the most important one again for us. This is babies. So not human population, but additions. How many people are we adding to the population of the world each year? And you'll see that it loops. Now remember, babies are only part of population growth. The bulk of population growth is people living longer. It's people like me, not conveniently dying in my 40s or early 50s, but still being around now and hopefully around for a few decades yet. That is the bulk of current population growth. But the babies add a little bit to it. And what this graph shows is a couple of interlocking global baby booms. There was one in the years before 1950. It wasn't just a post-World War II baby boom. It was associated with the partition of India, the revolution in China and so on, and a time when we weren't measuring babies very well, but that's our first baby boom. Slows down by the mid-1950s worldwide. Second baby boom, not directly connected, not the babies of those babies in 1963. Slowed down in the 1970s. Increase again simply because there are more mothers from the past. Those 1983 births, the mothers, age 20 would be an average age around the world to have a baby. So you can see that the peak rises. But then that spiraling up series of baby booms comes to an abrupt end in the 1990s and early 2000s. Right? We're entering a different time when we are not going to add more and more babies with successive baby booms. The slowdown in births is quite dramatic. And that slowdown, of course, has been accelerated with the pandemic. People have had fewer children in the pandemic than they were expected to have before the pandemic. Final thing about life expectancy. And what I've done here is to show you actual life expectancy in the world, the global average life expectancy each year, in its 50s in the 1970s, getting into our 60s in the 1980s, getting into our late 60s by the late 1990s, into our 70s now. The estimates at the end are from the World Bank. I think they're ludicrous. I don't think we're going to see that sudden lift off in life expectancy, I think if you look at the actual real data to 2020, you can see that the improvements of the past are slowing down. We're not going to get those increases again. We're not in very, very large numbers be living into our late 80s and into our 90s. Some of us will. But that trend, that graph is so leaning to the left that it's showing a slowdown of the improvement of life expectancy since 1966. This slowdown has been going on a long time. I'm going to show you one slide about the pandemic, and then really we'll bring this to an end. This is data for Scotland, but I thought I would put it in. It's excess deaths going back to 1860. The graph was produced by the BBC. And the reason I thought I'd put this in is that people often say, oh, we should expect to get more and more and more pandemics in the future because there are more of us. Well, that hasn't been the case. We haven't got a lot of the 19th century here, but believe you me, it was cholera, typhus, pandemic after pandemic around the world. And then the rates reduced. The Russian flu, which may have been a coronavirus, you can see then around 1889, 1890, 1891, huge numbers of excess deaths. What's labelled World War I is actually the flu pandemic of 1918, 1919, some in 1920. World War II was a far bigger killer from actually the military action. You then see after World War II, some tiny stubs of flu pandemics, but hardly anything until we get COVID-19. Although look before COVID-19, and as Bev said in the very kind introduction, we actually had as many excess deaths in the years collected before 2020 in Scotland and in England. In the austerity years, those little red bars add up to the height of that COVID-19 bar. We have AIDS, which is less obvious there because it's a slow pandemic. But things like pandemics where we say we'll see more and more, faster and faster. But if you look back, we haven't. And I do think it's important to actually look at these things. My last spiraling graph is the last graph, which is in the slowdown book. And this is a homage really to the people who created this kind of graphing in social science, which were Japanese social scientists. And this is a complicated graph, but it's about suburbanization in Tokyo and whether the suburbs are going faster than the middle or not, whether skyscrapers in the middle going up faster or the suburb going up faster. And at different times, one was and one wasn't. And so the graph spirals around. But in recent years, it's settled in the middle as a city like Tokyo becomes stable, stops growing quite as quickly, either in the middle or the edges, and begins to take on a form which is sustainable and not erratic anymore. So that's the last graph in the book. Here's the graph I promised you at the very beginning. If you think that you've seen these before, you may well have done. They're called phase portraits in maths and physics, and most famously, they're used to show the position and momentum of a pendulum. And a pendulum produces this perfect, miraculous spiral as it slows down. The horizontal axis showing you speed of change, velocity, the vertical axis showing you the position of the pendulum, how far to the right, how far to the left is it. And eventually, as it slows and slows, it gets right into the middle before we start the whole thing again and pull it out and let it flow free. And then the spiral begins again from the very, very outside. All I've done is taken this way of looking at data and change and applied it to social science data, because social science data has increased in quality enough to make that possible. Because as I say, the data has to be of really good quality. The other trick, in case you want to know it, is that never measure change at the exact point you're looking at. Always measure it from the period before to the period after. And if you do that, your graphs are nice and smooth and understandable. And if you don't do that, you get wiggly messes. I don't have a technical term for that technique, but it is like the idea that you can't tell how something is changing at the exact point it is moving in physics. To actually measure change reliably, you need a little bit of a gap before and a gap after to get a better smoother measure of change. My final slide. So I'll hand over to Bev in a minute. And here's more speculative conclusions. I hope you'll accept that there is a lot of evidence that we're slowing down, not least and most importantly, our actual numbers. Aging is not going to get increasing in terms of we will not get older and older and older in future generations. Life expectancy increases are slowing down. So population numbers will not go up and up and up because we live longer and longer. And we're also choosing to have fewer and fewer children. That means a human population that's going to stabilize in the lifetimes of the youngest children now. And we've never seen anything like that before. And to the extent that we ever have, it's been due to absolute disaster. The introduction of plagues and diseases from human population movement, slavery, militarism, colonization in the 1800s. This slowdown is slow, steady, and chosen. I think slowdown has huge implications. When we were accelerating, when GDP was rising on average faster than it was rising the year before, say in the 1950s, some years in the 1960s, you could tell people that, don't worry, future generations will be better off, they'll have more. You don't have to worry about who's got a lot and who hasn't, everything's going to get better. There'll be amazing new technology. When I was a child, we were told that we'd be able to teleport in future. We'd have little rocket ships that we could individually move around on. We'd be going to Mars. I was a baby when we first landed on the moon. We haven't done anything quite as exciting as that since I was a baby. I was a baby when the first 747 aeroplane set off. We still fly in 747s. I was an older teenager when I first saw a computer with Windows, like the one I'm looking at now. I was at university when I first used email. I still use email now. The changes were faster in the past. For my grandparents, they saw horses being used in the fields. The first tractors only came in when my grandparents were children. They heard of the first flights. Later on in their lives, they got to go on a package holiday in a jet. The change for them was utterly unbelievable from their childhood to the end of their days. The change for my parents was huge, from the 1940s when they were born through to now. Incredible change, or the last few decades, not as much, not as exciting. The change for me, I've described part of it, fast changing when I was young, much less now. The change for my children, I think, will be even less again. Slowdown hopefully means goods lasting longer, means less waste, means we think more about sustainability, but it's also going to mean that we have to think about inequality, because you cannot tell people, don't worry, your children will be okay because of the general acceleration that's occurring, because it is not occurring. Thank you very much for your patience and for putting up with me, and I hope you've got some questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danny, and as always, very interesting and challenging.